Alright, so let's start adding some services that our application will need. Remember, ASP.NET Core 3.0 is designed to be very lightweight, so everything we need has to be explicitly added to the application. It rarely adds anything for us. So even though we are creating MVC application, the ASP.NET Core doesn't know it yet. So we actually have to first include a support for MVC. And we do that in our configure services. So we will add the support for the MVC to our services collection. So we'll start with services dot add, and what we want to add is not MVC. That's what we used to use for the previous versions of .NET Core, but we can use now add over here controllers with views, and you can see that it adds services for controllers to the specified iServices collection. So this basically enables us to use the MVC pattern for controllers, models, and views. And like I said, this is a new service that is only in .NET Core 3.0. You won't find it in previous versions. So now let's go to our configure method. And notice that the method takes iWebHost environment type over here. Basically, it will tell the application what environment it should run in. And we want to run it in development by default, which already is set up for us. And here we use the developer exception page. And this method allows us to display error messages encountered during development of the application. And this is very useful during the development, but of course you would want to disable this before you deploy the application live. Now to see the environments, let me just stretch this so you can see it. Right click the project and go to properties, and under debug you can see that we have our environment set to development, and we want to keep it that way for our purposes. But this is where you would change it manually if you wanted to deploy the application live. Now the second thing that the method expects is iApplicationBuilder type over here. And as the name implies, this is used to add middleware that will be used by the application to build it up. So let's add one. So we are using HTTPS, so we need to tell the application that we want to redirect pages to HTTPS. So up here before the routing, we will add to our iApplicationBuilder the redirect to HTTPS or use HTTPS redirections. Next, we need to enable the use of static files such as images, CSS, JavaScript, and others. So after that, we'll add another application builder, and that's going to be use static files. So this method will automatically search a directory in the application that is called www.root, and it will search it for all static files by default. So when we start working on our app, we will create that directory and place all our static files there. Now the use routing over here and the use endpoints, these were added automatically when the project was created. So when the app runs, the request simply returns a string hello world, as you can see over here. And we will of course be changing it. So these two methods, use routing and use endpoints, basically enable MVC to respond to requests. And we need the endpoints to use a controller routing, meaning that the request will go through a controller and the action on a controller, and it will be part of the URL. So let's change it. I'm going to delete this mapping for the hello world, and instead, like I said, we need to map it to a controller name and an action on a controller. And since we are going to be working with the database, the records have IDs, so we need to pass in also the optional parameter for the ID. So in our endpoints, we will do a map controller route. And this adds endpoints for the controller actions in the Microsoft.NET Core routing. So now let's specify what route we want to use. And the name of it will be simply default. That's gonna be a default route. And now we can specify the pattern for the default route. And the pattern will be simply the controller. So this is the controller name. And we can specify if no controller is specified, we will simply go to our home controller. After that, in the URL, we will expect the name of the action. So it's gonna be action equals, and by default we can specify index. So if we have no controller or no action specified, we'll simply go to home controller and index action. And if the controller is specified as well as the action, then we'll of course override this and we will redirect to that particular controller and action. And like I said, we also need the optional parameter for the ID so we can retrieve records from the database. So this is our mapping. We have a default map that expects the controller name. Let's say we have a controller called candy. Then it expects the action on it. Let's say a list of all candies. And then we can supply also ID of a particular candy if it's available. But it's an optional parameter, so we can omit it freely. Now we will go over routing in more details later, but for now just use this routing and understand that it allows us to use our web application to route through the request and return a response. And now let's move on and start creating our models, which is our classes for our application.